back. This is video 2 of the Gull Guide featured highlights, February 2025. Last time we defined juvenile plumage, and we learned that juvenile plumage is equivalent to and synonymous with the first basic plumage. And so if you see somewhere, somebody describing the first basic plumage, they're simply talking about the juvenile plumage. You see these two ring-billed gulls here in the center. The one on the left appears to be entirely juvenile. And we also, last time, talked about the first alternate plumage. The first cycle ring-billed on the right here has replaced all of these scapulars. It appears to be in first alternate plumage. Now, this first alternate plumage is slow-paced. It may suspend over the non-breeding season and then pick up again as we get closer to the breeding season. And that's likely what's happening with most of our large white-headed gulls. So, it's September now on the Great Lakes, and we see this individual with a very streaked head. It's not unusual as we get closer and closer to the breeding season, February, March, to have entirely white heads on all of these birds. Another thing I want to point out here is most of our first cycle ring-billed gulls have these silvery greater coverts. And it's pretty easy to imagine these being second generation feathers like these scapulars, but they're in fact different generations. These are juvenile silver or grayish greater coverts, and these are first alternate scapulars. They've actually been replaced. These scapulars have actually been replaced via a systematic molt, whereas these juvenile greater coverts are feathers that this bird left the breeding grounds with. Okay, second cycle ring-billed here. We won't talk much about that, but I want you to notice this striking juvenile with solid brown upper parts. It also has brownish greater coverts, which is sort of unusual. It's the exception for first cycle ring-billed gull. So this is a very, very uncharacteristic ring-billed gull. Still holding on to a mostly black bill, whereas the expected pattern is a bicolored bill by now. So some months later, first pre-alternate molt kicks in again, and we see white breast, white underparts, head, and that's variable. That could happen as early as October in some individuals, but typically it becomes more and more white as we get closer to the breeding season. In the foreground is a short-billed gull, kind of a small head, bug-eyed look, petite bill, and they commonly show this smudgy pattern on the nape on the head. One thing to note here, if you're comparing their first alternate plumages, is ring-billed gull will often have a more extensive first pre-alternate molt. And we can see here that it's replaced some upper tertials, some inner greater coverts, some inner median coverts, and that typically doesn't happen with short-billed gull. Short-billed gull will hold on to all of its juvenile tertials, juvenile wing coverts until they arrive at the breeding grounds, and they will molt right into their second basic plumage without ever replacing wing coverts and tertials in the first pre-alternate molt. So we may say this ring-billed gull has a somewhat moderate first pre-alternate molt, and this short-billed has a more limited first pre-alternate molt. So here are the extremes here. These are both first cycle short-billed gulls on page 19. A fresh first basic individual or juvenile in August. And these birds that linger after the winter season on the California coast, as far as Baja California, they become very bleached, very sullied. But you'll notice they still have juvenile primaries and secondaries for the most part. They'll hold on to those more or less until about May, even June. For identification purposes here, you'll notice this is a medium gray. It's not a very clear, silvery, pale gray that we find in ring-billed and herrings. That could be useful. Also, the bill is just a bit more petite than ring-billed. Ring-billed will often have this pinkish bill base with a sharper demarcation. With short-billed, the pattern is a little more diffuse often, although they can show bicolored bills with bright bill bases, but that's not the typical pattern. So at the end of video 1, I said we would talk about more interesting first pre-alternate molts. If you looked at this individual here, most people that look at gulls casually might age this bird as a second cycle. This is a yellow-footed gull, and it is in fact a first cycle. The upper parts, at least everything we can see of the upper parts, the scapulars, the upper wing coverts, the tertials, all of these appear to be second generation. They all appear to be replaced feathers in the first pre-alternate molt. However, if we zoom in on the primaries, these primaries appear to be first generation. They have these pointed tips. But to age gulls, to really get a good sense of what's happening with their molt, you have to look at the open wing. And so here's this individual with an open wing, same bird. And we see here that not all of the wing coverts have actually been replaced. There's, this is again on page 23, and it's actually labeled in the guide. And I just want you to ponder some of the first generation versus second generation feathers that you're seeing here. If you wanted to pause here and just take a look at the patterns on the tail, on the wing coverts, and even the tertials, if you're able to make out those tertials underneath the longest scapulars. So here it is. This is the labeled first cycle yellow-footed gull. I see clearly there is a couple of generations of tail feathers. These frayed brown feathers are juvenile, and then the black ones with white tips are first alternate, so those are newer. On the upper wing panel, we can see this molt limit that clearly delineates older juvenile greater coverts from these newer, plainer greater coverts. So that molt limit is actually not seen on the perched bird. So let's go back to that perched bird. We have this thing. Those outer greater coverts that are juvenile are sitting right here underneath these breast and flank feathers. And we mentioned in the first video that's pretty common to not be able to see those outer greater coverts. Okay, so what plumage, what age is this bird? This bird, being in January, is probably just about 9 months old or so. They hatch a little bit sooner than birds in mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere. This is a Baja California resident for the most part. It's a first cycle. Its plumage is first alternate. And we can see that none of these outer primaries have been replaced. Most of these secondaries are juvenile. However, if we zoom in very closely, this secondary here and maybe the one next to it are first alternate. The tertials are first alternate, and of course these scapulars are first alternate. All of these wing coverts are first alternate. Now, as far as the upper tail coverts, we're not sure. Those could be juvenile. Most yellow-footed gulls have sparsely marked upper tail coverts. They're not as heavily barred as, say, western gull. But my feeling is that they're first alternate. Also, they look pretty fresh at the tips. So this species overlaps with western gull in a couple of places, the Salton Sea as well as Baja California. And if there is ever any question about, is this a yellow-footed, is this a western, they do resemble each other heavily at times. There'd be no question it would be an undisputed yellow-footed gull just based on the tail molt, having those tail feathers replaced in first pre-alternate. Western gull generally doesn't do that. Neither do any of our other large gulls in the northern hemisphere. Now, there are exceptions, and some of the neater things are things like nominate lesser blackback gulls, which we don't expect in North America, Hoogland's gull, and some of the kelp gulls in the southern hemisphere. And so let's take a look here at something relevant to what's happening in the ABA area right now. You have this first cycle kelp gull that popped up on the radar in late December in the Corpus Christi region off the Gulf Coast of Texas. This bird is very similar to what we just saw with this yellow-footed gull. Most of the upper parts here are first alternate. These tertials are first alternate. The breasts and body feathers are first alternate. And if you look closely on the tail here, this appears to be a new tail. Much black with white tips. But the primaries with these pointed tips are first basic. These are juvenile primaries. And I mention this because if you look at the open wing of this bird, here it is on the 3rd of January, you'll notice it also has replaced some tail feathers. So most of the tail hair is new. Most of these feathers are first alternate. They have these white bases, this marbled pattern. And you compare that to these juvenile or first basic outer tail feathers. So again, this is another red flag, a signal that something different is in the field here. If you zoom in on these inner secondaries, these tertials here, it's also replaced some of these. This is not expected in most of our northern hemisphere gulls. The wing coverts, the scapulars are all first alternate. And amazingly, this bird, it has just been moving around on the Texas Gulf Coast. On the underside, you get a better view of these older feathers. You can see better contrast here with these browner outer tail feathers. There's 2 of them on this side and 1 of them on the left side. One thing I want to point out, when these birds shift their wings, you can often see the underside of the tertials just at the right angle. But as far as identification, one thing I noticed when I was looking at kelp gulls in Peru is many of them in first cycle will show this bluish tibia. It very much resembles what you would see in like a late first cycle California gull. And it seems to be pretty consistent, and I think it could be useful in identification. They have this pretty stout bill, pretty strong bill, although some of the literature seems to have overemphasized the bill shape of kelp gulls. Some are bulbous tip, as we see in like glaucous wing and western gull, but others can be just as straight as herring gull. They're rarely as thin as, say, lesser blackback gull, but they are pretty strong bills with some variation, of course. All right, so it is now January 6th, and this bird is still being seen off Corpus Christi. You see this outer first basic juvenile tail feather, the 2 on this side, and the rest of those tail feathers are first alternate. Some newer first alternate feathers here on the lower scapulars. But interestingly, this bird suddenly now is missing a primary. So let's number these. We have 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and P1 is missing. And so this P1 having been dropped is typically our signal as field observers to understand that the second complete molt has begun. And this second pre-basic molt, or second complete molt, will go on for some months, sometimes 4 to 6 months. And what we'll see is more and more primaries dropped. And in this time, every other feather track should see some molt, body feathers, flight feathers, as this bird completes the second pre-basic molt. That's going to be more a focus of the next video, what these pre-basic molts look like, how they vary from group to group. But amazingly, just last week, this bird was located several hundred miles south in Brownsville, Texas, in Cameron County. It was spotted at the Brownsville landfill, an amazing place for gull watching almost any time of year. And now we see this larger molt gap where the primaries and secondaries come together. So let's count these primaries. We have 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. This is P4. And so P1 and P3 are now dropped. So that's a pretty significant molt gap there. Sometimes they can be a little larger. I've seen ringbills and herrings missing P1 to P5 at times, some lesser blackbacks. It's pretty extreme. But when these molt gaps develop, we don't generally expect gulls to do any long distance migrating with these inner primaries dropped. They typically like to molt 1 or 2 at a time and move short distances as they're molting these primaries. And so, who knows? Birders may be lucky to keep spotting this thing along the coast as it feeds and molts out these primaries in its second pre-basic molt. All right, so we're going to wrap it up here. We've discussed now in detail some of the more interesting pre-alternate molts that we can see in the ABA area. The extremes being things like yellow-footed gull and the occasional stray kelp gull like this can be identified and at least spotted or suspected just basically from looking at this bird's molt pattern. It's a very different look than what we expect to see on January large white-headed gulls. Next time, we're going to go into detail on pre-basic molts. If you want to get a head start, we're going to describe the 4 molt strategies that are generally found in birds. You can find out on page 20. The 4 molt strategies that are found in birds. We'll talk specifically about the patterns that are found in gulls. Some of the smaller gulls like Bonaparte's, black-headed, Sabin's gull, they have some interesting inserted molts. We'll talk about those next time. But if you need any additional details on anything that's been said in this video, please reach out. If you go to the Gull Guide and look at some of the younger ages of these kelp gulls and yellow-footed gulls, you'll see more examples of this with open wings. But most fascinating from all these examples that I haven't mentioned is Franklin's gull. Check out the plate on page 139. I believe it's plate 16. Plate 16 on page 139. That Franklin's gull has molted primaries and secondaries in its first pre-alternate molt. Franklin's is an exceptional case. It's our most unique gull when it comes to molt strategy. Read about that if you're interested, and let me know if you have any questions. And I think that'll be it for this video. Email me, drop me a line if you have any requests for future videos. Thank you for watching, guys, and we'll talk to you next time. Goodbye.